The Davis Learning Strategies is a 2-day workshop for mainstream teachers of ages 5 to 7. The Davis Learning Strategies program is the result of 6 years of classroom research and observation. In a pilot study conducted among 2 Californian government schools, the program was introduced in successive years to children in grades K to 2, which are ages 5 to 7. 3 classroom groups were compared with demographically matched groups who had received the same basic language arts curriculum without the supplementary Davis program. In America, the national average of special needs referrals is 15%, and in the control groups, that was the same. But also, the national average in America of gifted referrals, children that are referred to accelerated learning programs, is 5%. In the Davis classrooms that were included in the study, the first one showed not a single special need referral and doubling in gifted referrals, 10% compared to the national average of 5%. The second Davis classroom had again not a single special need referral, but this time quadrupling of gifted referrals, 20%. The third Davis classroom again had not a single special needs referral, but this time we saw 40% gifted referrals. That's 8 times the national average, almost half the class. Walls Elementary School introduced Davis Learning Strategies in 2003. They have a fully licensed Davis facilitator in-house and all staff trained in Davis Learning Strategies. 4 years after they introduced Davis Learning Strategies, they had the highest reading scores in Colorado, with 89% of learners scoring at or above grade level proficiency. Another Colorado school, Albert Elementary, introduced the Davis Learning Strategies in 2006. They, at that point, had the worst reading scores in their education district. 17 teachers were trained in Davis Learning Strategies, and within a year, their reading scores were the best of all schools in their district. 2 years later, they still retained this position. Lalaji Memorial Omega International School is a mouthful. It's an Indian school. We could call it LMOIS. They have 6,000 learners. And in 2013, they discovered the 2-day Davis Learning Strategies workshop. Today, LMOIS has 115 DLS trained teachers, 3 DLS mentors, and 2 fully licensed Davis facilitators who set up a remedial department called Indigo within the school. 3 years later, over 90% of the Indigo students scored more than 70% in their grade 10 exams. In New Zealand, we have new data. Only 6 months after attending the 2-day DLS workshop, we looked at the percentage of failing 6 to 8-year-olds students who are no longer failing. Now, teachers often attend workshops and learn new things, but only partially implement them. We still saw over 50% drop in 6 to 8-year-olds failing to learn to read. If Davis Learning Strategies were fully implemented, we saw almost 80% drop in failing 6 to 8-year-olds. In New Zealand, they have national standards, and the national average of schools meeting or surpassing those standards is 78%. In 2014, Waihao Downs School was below the national average, but within a year of using Davis Learning Strategies, they had reached the national average. Their learners kept improving. And in 2018, over 90% of Waihao Downs learners met or surpassed the national standards in New Zealand. That's almost a 20% increase in reading performance. But you might be curious about why it's not 100%. Who are the nearly 10% of learners who still don't meet the national standards in Waihao Downs? Let's have a look at that. Every single child in Waihao Downs that has been exposed to Davis Learning Strategies is now reaching or surpassing the national standards for reading in New Zealand. So the ones that are still failing are children who have not been exposed to Davis learning strategies. Since introduction of Davis learning strategies in Waihao Down, there has been no reading recovery intervention required. There has also been a dramatic drop in playground behavior incidences. Now, in order to introduce Davis learning strategies in a school, we want ideally the head of foundation phase to be on board, as well as the school management. But to ensure motivation, ideally we want each teacher to opt in to be trained. On average, one teacher is trained for each of the grades 0, 1 and 2. That would generally be a minimum of 3 teachers per school. The cost of training each of these 3 teachers is 7,200 Rand, or about $500, which means that the total cost of training 3 teachers would be 21,600 Rand. But let's look at how a school can justify that investment. 21,600 Rand, or $1,500 roughly, can be spread over 6 years because the average retention of a teacher is probably around 5 to 6 years. So if you have a school where the teacher to learner ratio is 12 learners per teacher, this would actually come down to about 300 Rand per learner, roughly $20. But most private schools in South Africa have actually a ratio of about 24 learners per teacher in the first 3 grades. So in that situation, we see the cost dropping to 150 Rand per learner. In a government school in South Africa, the cost per learner would be about 75 Rand per learner, or just about $5 per learner. Total training costs spread over 24 learners, that's an average school, for 6 years, would come to about 144 learners. And that would then be roughly 150 Rand per learner, or about $10. This does not include the cost of plasticine or clay, which is pretty much the only additional consumable in Davis learning strategies. And that's about 60 Rand per learner, or about $4 per learner. But shouldn't all schools have plasticine in any case? Now, DLS benefits extend well beyond the first 3 years, even though they're only used in the first 3 years. It lays a foundation for effortless learning and teaching for the rest of the learner's education. The cost of DLS could therefore arguably be spread over every learner in the school, and not just the first 3 grades. In a school with 24 learners per grade, 0 to 8, the cost could easily be halved again per learner. In that case, in an average private school, an annual DLS levy of 75 Rand, or $5 per learner, will cover the cost of training 3 DLS learners every 6 years. If teacher training colleges were to offer DLS in regular teacher training, that could cut costs dramatically again. Now let's look at estimated return on Davis Learning Strategies investment. In the UK in 2004, the government was spending roughly 13% of the education budget on special needs. We don't have a breakdown for the UK in terms of how much of the 13% special needs budget is spent on dyslexia, but in the US it's more than half. So let's assume it's the same in the UK, and then we're looking at 7%. If we want to implement Davis learning strategies in every single school in the UK, the cost would in fact be 0.6%, and we could spread that over 3 years. That would be 0.2% additional expense for 3 years running. Now, that is a one-off cost. Now, as you can see in year 3 of implementing Davis learning strategies, we estimate a drop of 1% in the budget requirements for dyslexia. It actually does not mean a saving in special needs budget, but freeing up resources that can be allocated to other special needs than dyslexia. It's in fact not until year 4 that we expect a drop in the education budget. The 7% of the education budget, which in the UK was spent on dyslexia alone, amounts to £4 billion every year. 0.6% extra investment to roll out Davis learning strategies in every single school in the UK could potentially free up 2% of the ongoing education budget, or about £1 billion every year. This represents at least 300% return on investment within 4 years. The following years, we estimate the same 300% return on investment every single year. So this is an exponential return on investment, which over time goes way beyond 300% return on investment. Now, in a country like South Africa, where over 10% of the education budget is not yet spent on special needs, Davis learning strategies could help prevent this investment requirement in the first place. So instead of going the same route as the UK and the US and spending over 10% of the education budget on special needs, South Africa could decide to spend less than 1% of the education budget once to address the special needs requirements in the South African education system, while at the same time improving reading performance dramatically